Sup guys? In this video, I'm going to share with you a bunch of different ways that the results screen could be misleading you. With this knowledge, you should be able to better interpret the data that it gives you, as a surface level reading of the results could potentially do more harm than good to your understanding of the game. So the first way that the results screen could be misleading is that you can't tell how much each ship's buffs are contributing. It's quite obvious and not necessarily the fault of the results screen, yet ships are often underestimated, especially by newer players, because it's quite difficult to parse how much buffs are actually contributing as opposed to final damage output. Let's take this end screen as an example here and see how much Aurora is actually contributing. First, we need to take the other two Vanguard's damage and divide them by 1.35, which is how much they would have done without Aurora's help. Then, we take the difference between the buffed and unbuffed damage to see how much Aurora's buff contributed. Next, we add the buff contribution to Aurora's own damage, giving us Aurora's total damage contribution. But even then, we're still not done. In order to compare Aurora's total contribution with Unzen's, we need to use how much Unzen would have done without Aurora. In the end, we have about 147k damage for Aurora and 167k for Unzen. A pretty small difference of 20k, but keep in mind that Unzen is using all plus 13 damage equipment, while Aurora is only using plus 10, and is also acting as the tank for the fleet. Also, past Unzen and Shimakaze, there is a steep drop-off in Vanguard ships that can deal a lot of damage against heavy armor, and even more so when you account for the fact that you need a tank in your Vanguard as well. Aside from Aurora, there is another ship in this end screen that looks like she might not be doing much, but is actually contributing just as much as everyone else, and that is Nagato. Unlike Aurora though, it is much more difficult to parse out Nagato's contribution because a big part of her value is her reload buff. In some cases, it is only a marginal increase in total damage, but in other cases, it could let a carrier get off an entire airstrike. Going from 3 to 4 airstrikes is a total damage increase of 33%, and that's from the reload buff alone, without accounting for her other buffs, such as flat damage for carriers as well as accuracy, which is also very relevant for this fight. The only way to really assess Nagato's value is to see what it looks like if you didn't run her. You could try replacing her with another ship and do a relative assessment, but too many variables in the fleet would be different. The only reasonable metric you can go by is the average total final damage of the entire fleet, between using Nagato and not. For non-Nagato fleets, you may also need to remove some of the other ships that are only good because they're being buffed by Nagato, which introduces even more variables to account for. Another slightly different example is Implacable. Her slow effect can increase your total damage by multiple times, or it can do nothing at all depending on the movement pattern of the enemy. So while you can parse out some buffs from the result screen, there are other effects like reload buffs and slows that need extra steps to properly evaluate. So without getting too sidetracked, this is the reason that despite what the end screen might tell you, Shinano is, in most cases, stronger than Haku, and Vanguard is the best third battleship in pretty much all battleship fleets. The next way that the end screen could mislead you is what I would consider a direct flaw of the end screen, and that is the fact that it does not account for damage over time effects. These include burns and floods. This is pretty easy to demonstrate in a raid event that shows the total damage taken by the enemy as well as the damage of each ship in the end screen. Here is an example from the last raid event, in which Anshan's total damage was significantly lower than the total damage, which reminded me that DDG missiles have an extremely powerful burn. I've done testing for Azuma, Drake, Albacore, and some others, but there are a lot which I've never tested. Honestly though, they're not usually as big of a difference maker as buffs are, and their damage can be calculated quite accurately if you know the formula, and can be bothered to crunch the numbers. For example, Nana from my Discord calculated how much damage my Albacore would do with her burn for each tick, given her stats, and it came out to match how much it actually did. but you can see all the inputs that it requires just to do one calculation. How reliably these effects can be applied may vary though, so some field testing is still recommended. The next way that the result screen might mislead you is when anti-air or anti-submarine damage, which are both accounted for, get involved. Anti-air and anti-submarine damage are very important, but I'm pretty sure that people are not looking for anti-air damage when looking at the result screen. Ironically, even if they were looking for anti-air damage, they would still be misled by the result screen. Other than the fact that anti-submarine damage cannot be isolated from other sources of damage, and therefore there's no way to ever tell exactly how much damage it's doing, anti-air is even more of a nuisance. I will put the exact steps you need to go through in order to find the expected anti-air damage of every ship in the fleet, coming from ships with anti-air guns. Note that this doesn't work for a fighter anti-air. To this day, I have no clue how that is distributed, but since fighter anti-air is not aggregated like anti-air guns, it could just be properly accounted for. To summarize, broadly speaking, anti-air damage is randomly distributed to every ship with an anti-air gun mount, but weighted based on their anti-air stat alone. This means that a ship with higher anti-air stat but no anti-air gun equipped will be credited with more damage in the end screen than a ship with lower anti-air stat but much higher efficiency and the rainbow anti-air gun equipped, despite the latter actually having done more anti-air damage. If you're a dishonest actor, you could conduct a bunch of tests for ships in an environment with enemy planes, remove their anti-air guns but not equalize for anti-air stat, and pass it off as an unbiased test. So there's a little useful tidbit for you misinfo spreaders out there. I do have a video where I go a little more in-depth about isolating AA damage, which I'll leave in the description. Feel free to check it out if you're interested. Just don't take seriously the result screen in any stage with planes, and don't bother testing ships there. It's just not worth the hassle. The last way that the result screen could be misleading you has to do with the order in which ships strike. Take the Arbiter Hermit fight, for example. There are suicide ships as well as adds that are summoned at around 1 minute and 6 seconds remaining in the fight. Let's say you're using a carrier fleet. Only one carrier is really going to strike when the suicide ships come, since they get instantly exploded by any bombs that hit them, and that carrier will get a lot of damage added to their total, even though any of your 3 carriers could have done the same. The same goes for the adds, which have quite a lot more HP than suicide ships, but still, whichever carrier launches first will get the lion's share of the damage done to those adds for their total, despite the fact that those adds were going to die to splash damage from dive bombers, regardless of which carrier launched first. And this ends up being misleading since I'm sure most people are just trying to find out how much damage their ships dealt to the actual boss. Here is another example. It's not guaranteed that every ship will get off the same amount of attacks by the time the battle ends. For example, let's take Saratoga and Jade, and let's say that Jade only deals about 60% of Saratoga's damage per airstrike, but with slightly lower cooldown. However, if the fight ends after Jade's second airstrike, then Jade's total damage from her 2 airstrikes will be 120% of Saratoga's 1 airstrike. If you're looking at it for what it is, which is, in this specific fight, Jade was able to do more total damage than Saratoga, then it's fine, but problems arise if you attempt to draw any conclusions about Jade generally being stronger than Saratoga from it. In the past, this had led some people to believe that Perseus was one of the strongest carriers, because in their low-level stages, the fights were finished before other carriers even got a strike in. The final example comes in the form of overkilling. Imagine if your fleet is something like Unicorn, Perseus, and preloaded Aquila. Whichever preload strikes first will likely clear the first wave of enemies, and then the other 2 carriers will hit the water where the enemies once were. By no means are the other 2 airstrikes useless in general, but in this situation, they were set up to be useless. This is just a very clear example of it, but it doesn't have to occur strictly around preloads. It indicates that you should consider changing your fleet a bit so that the damage does not go to waste, but does not demonstrate that the ship which went first is generally stronger. Anyways, that is most of the ways which I can think of for now, in which the result screen could mislead you. Keep in mind that multiple of these can occur at the same time. So for instance, you could be playing a stage which has enemy planes, using ships with damage over time, with a bunch of buffer ships, and your strike order is not giving each ship equal opportunity to deal damage. Even if you don't fully understand some of these points yet, you don't have to worry because it won't really affect your gameplay, but just don't lean too much on the results screen to inform your opinion on which ships are the best. And that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.